Today will be lesson 10, and we're going to be covering whole rests and half rests in more detail. All right, so first of all, let's remember that note values, once we see them placed on a staff, will tell us which pitches or sounds to play, and they'll also tell us when and how long to play those sounds for. Whereas rests are going to be showing us when and how long to play or hold a silence.
Reviewing that the staff will consist of 5 lines and 4 spaces that we number from the bottom to the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines and 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces. We can put a whole note on space 1, and that would be just an open note head with no stem. We can put a half note on line 2, which would be an open note head right over top of that line with a stem going up and on the right. Because this note head is below line 3, we could have a quarter note on space 3. And we'd want the stem to go on the left and down because this note head is above line 3. And then we could have an 8th note sitting right on line 5, nicely centered with the filled in note head. A stem going down and on the left because it's also above line 3. And then we need a little flag to the right. We learned about clefs, which is what a composer will add to the leftmost side of a staff to help us know how to decode the pitches. We learned about a treble or G clef. The treble or G clef would start on line 2, bump up to line 3, down and bumping line 1, up and around, back down again. We call it the G clef because every clef has a code embedded in it. This one is because of the curly Q here, everything's centering around line 2. If we were to put a note head right on line 2, it would be given the pitch, assigned the pitch G. From there, we can decode all the other pitches on that staff or above and below that staff. So again, that's a treble or G clef. We also learned about the bass clef or F clef, which would start on line 4, bump up to line 5, like half a heart, stopping just below line 2. And there would be a dot in space 4, a dot in space 3. These 3 dots together help highlight the 4th line. If we were to put a note head there, it would be an F, and from there we'd be able to decode all the other pitches on that staff or above and below that staff. Remembering that note values will tell us when and how long to hold pitches or sounds for once they're placed on a score, and rests will tell us when and how long to hold silences for once they're placed on a score. We're going to try drawing the note value pyramid and the rest value pyramid next to each other. So first of all, we have our longest note value or rest value, which is a whole note, an open note head. So this will be our whole note or our whole rest. And our whole rest will just be that heavy hat hanging down from line 4. We can break either the whole rest or the whole note into 2 equal parts. And these would be called half notes, where we just add a stem to the open note head, or half rests, which would be a light hat sitting on line 3. These half notes or half rests will be worth half the value or half the duration of a whole note or whole rest. We can break each of these into 2 equal parts. With the note, we'll just add 1 notation element by filling in the note head. And with the rests, we will then draw what looks like a Z with a tail. And these will represent quarter notes or quarter rests. They're called that because they're worth a quarter of the value or be held for a quarter of the duration of a whole note or whole rest. We can break these into 2 equal parts as well. They will be worth half the duration of a quarter note or quarter rest. We're going to call these eighth notes or eighth rests. They look like a quarter note, but with a little flag hanging down. That's the extra notation element we add. Sometimes we connect those flags in the form of a beam, just a single beam, and you can beam 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these eighth notes together if you want to, but there'll always be one beam or one flag. So again, these are eighth notes or eighth rests. When we get to the rest, they'll look a little like a swoopy 7. You can kind of see that tail element that we have in the note value pyramid as well. And then these are called eighth notes because they're worth just an eighth of the value of a whole note or whole rest. Then we can take each of these and break them into 2 equal parts, and these will be called 16th notes or 16th rests. For the notes, we're going to add just one notation element, and that is going to be that they look a lot like a quarter note, but instead of just having the one beam of the eighth note, they're going to have 2 beams. Or we might see them as having, if they're all by themselves, 2 flags. It's unusual to see them all by themselves, though not very often, occasionally. All right. And it'll take 16 of those to equal the same value or the same duration as one whole note or whole rest. Again, we can break these eighth rests down into little 16th rests as well. I'm not going to draw these because they get a little crammed, but they'll have that 2 flag kind of element to them as well, looking very much like an eighth rest, but with the 2 swoopy flags. And I'm just going to draw dot, dot, dot to indicate we need 16 of them to equal the same duration as a whole rest. Remember that until a composer has placed these symbols on a score with additional decoding information, the only thing we can know at this point is the fixed relative value of these notes rather than a specific beat or duration assignment. So we know that a whole note is definitely worth twice as much as a half note is worth twice as much as a quarter note is worth twice as much as an eighth note is worth twice as much as a 16th note. We can also know that a whole rest will be worth twice as much as a half rest will be worth twice as much as a quarter rest will be worth twice as much as an eighth rest will be worth twice as much as a 16th rest. So we're on to Unit 2, Lesson 2. We're covering rhythm, and this is the whole rest and half rest. So we're just going to read this together. This is a whole rest. The silence of a whole rest lasts as long as the sound of a whole note. Another way of saying that would be the silence of a whole rest will last the same duration as the sound of a whole note. Right? So one whole rest will represent when, it will tell us when and how long to hold a silence on a score, whereas one whole note will tell us when and how long to hold a pitch or a sound once it's placed on a score. This is a half rest. The silence of a half rest lasts as long or will have the same duration as the sound of a half note. So again, this half rest will tell us when and how long to hold a silence for. This half note will tell us when and for how long to hold a pitch or a sound for. Here's how to draw a whole rest and a half rest. They look the same, but they're not. If you look closely, you'll see that a whole rest always hangs from the 4th line. Notice this, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you'll see it's hanging. We've talked about it being heavy. That's why it hangs, like a hat hanging from line 4. A half rest always sits on the 3rd line. So we'll count again, 1, 2, 3. And you'll see it's like a hat that's lighter, so it's sitting on line 3. So the whole rest will have the longer duration and will be heavier, right? And the half rest will have the shorter duration, half as long as a whole rest, and it will be lighter sitting on line 3. So the author just reiterates what we've already talked about. Some people remember the difference between a whole rest and a half rest this way. Because a whole rest lasts longer than a half rest, it is heavier, so it has to hang from a line, line 4. Because a half rest is shorter, it is lighter and can sit on a line, line 3. Trace the whole rest shown below, then draw 5 more whole rests to the right of the rest you traced. So we'll just do that together. So we'll just trace this. And I usually just sort of draw a rectangle without the top line. And we're just hanging it. Ideally, they should all be the same width, but, you know, it is what it is. And then trace the half rest shown below, then draw 5 more half rests to the right of the rest you traced. So we'll just do that. Sitting on line 3. All right, so continuing through this assignment, circle all the whole rests in the staff below. Notice the distinction here, whole rests. So we have a quarter rest. We have a whole note, just the open oval with no stem. Then we have a heavy hat hanging from line 4, so we're going to circle him. We have a light hat, still a hat, but it's sitting on line 3, so that's going to be a half rest. And then we have an 8th rest. Then we have another heavy hat hanging from line 4, so that again will be the whole rest. And then we have a quarter note, not even a rest, right? And then we have a half rest because it's sitting on line 3, so it's lighter, not worth as much as the whole rest. Circle all the half rests on the staff below. So let's see, we see a hat, but it's a heavy one. It's hanging from line 4, so that's going to be a whole rest. We see a quarter note. We see a hat sitting on line 3, so that's the lighter one, so that will be the half rest, worth half as much as a whole rest or held for half the duration as a whole rest. So we'll circle that guy. This is an 8th note and an 8th rest. And then we have a half rest again sitting on line 3, so it's not worth as much as a whole rest. And then we have another whole rest because it's hanging from line 4, and a half note because it has the open note head that our whole note has, but a stem has been added to it, so it's the next level down. Only one of the rests below is a correct whole rest. Circle it. Well, I see here this one is attached to line 2, hanging, so that's good, but wrong line. This one is hanging from line 4, and it's that heavy hat, right? So that's it. This is the half rest, correctly drawn. This is a whole rest, again, incorrectly drawn because it is hanging from line 3. All right, and we're just finishing up this lesson. Only one of the rests below is a correct half rest. Circle it. So we're looking for a rest that's going to be a hat that's going to be lighter sitting on line 3. Let's see. This hat is sitting on line 2. So close, but not quite. And then we have a whole rest because this is a heavy hat hanging from line 4. We have a heavy hat hanging from line 3. Here we have a light hat sitting on line 3, so that's going to be our half rest. Whole rest or half rest or neither, circle the correct answer. So obviously this rest is sitting on line 1, so we know that's neither, right? And then the next rest is a heavy hat hanging from line 4. That sounds pretty familiar, so that's going to be our whole rest, worth the longest duration. Then we have a light hat sitting on line 2. That's going to be neither. We have a light hat sitting on line 3. That also sounds familiar, so that's our half rest. And then we have a light hat, but it's sitting on line 4. So again, that's neither.